You just heard the sound of a bubble bursting. Not a financial one, not yet at least, but something almost as fragile. For months, the WNBA was sold to us as the next big thing. Every headline, every viral clip, every interview painted the same picture. This was the moment women's basketball had finally arrived. The crowds were growing, the energy was real, and the league was supposedly breaking through barriers that had held it back for decades. It felt unstoppable, until it wasn't. Because when the biggest stage of the season, the 2025 WNBA Finals, finally came around, something unbelievable happened. The buzz disappeared, the seats went empty, and the same league that had been bragging about record growth was suddenly begging people to show up for $35 tickets. That's not a typo. $35 for a championship seat. And when fans saw those empty rows, that eerie silence echoing across what should have been a sold-out arena, the illusion cracked. The story we'd all been told about record-breaking viewership, about unstoppable growth, about a movement that couldn't be ignored, suddenly looked like a house of cards built on hype. But that's not even the shocking part. The real story isn't that attendance dropped, it's why it dropped, and who the league quietly depended on to hold everything together. Because once you strip away the social media noise, the highlight reels, and the PR spin, one truth remains. The WNBA's entire rise may have been built on the back of one single player. And when she wasn't there, the bubble popped in front of the entire world. Today we're diving into what really happened behind the silence. From the empty seats in Las Vegas, to the furious reactions from players who felt betrayed, to the uncomfortable truth about Caitlin Clark's real value to the league, and what that means for the future of women's basketball as a whole. If you think you already know the story, think again, because what happened at the 2025 WNBA Finals wasn't a marketing failure, it was a full-blown market correction, and the fallout is far from over. The 2025 WNBA Finals were supposed to be a celebration, the ultimate proof that the league had arrived. Two powerhouse teams, the Las Vegas Aces and the Phoenix Mercury, battling for the crown. A season of viral moments, record-breaking storylines, and bold promises, all building to this single moment of glory. Except when game night finally came around, there was no glory. The first warning signs appeared days before tip-off. Analysts noticed something strange. Tickets weren't selling. Not just slow sales, we're talking free fall. For a championship game, you'd expect nosebleed seats to cost hundreds, maybe even thousands. Instead, verified ticket sites were showing $35 seats. Social media piled on, mocking screenshots of resellers dropping prices to single digits, $6 just to walk through the door. And when the cameras went live, the nightmare was impossible to hide. Row after row of empty red seats. Wide shots that looked more like a pre-season scrimmage than a final showdown. The supposed pinnacle of the sport looked deserted. It wasn't just a bad look, it was a gut punch. For years, the league had been building toward this moment. More media coverage, bigger sponsorships, national TV deals. And yet when the lights were brightest, almost no one showed up. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was haunting. Imagine spending your entire career fighting for this moment, grinding through off-seasons, injuries, endless flights, to finally reach the finals, and when you look up into the stands, half the seats are empty. That's exactly what the players felt. A mix of confusion, disbelief, and something deeper. Humiliation. And nowhere was that emotion more visible than in A'ja Wilson's eyes. The Aces superstar, a four-time MVP, the face of the league, stood during warm-ups staring into a sea of vacant seats. Cameras caught her muttering to herself, "This is the finals?" It wasn't arrogance, it was heartbreak. The realization that the league she carried, the league she believed in, didn't seem to believe in itself. Then came the game, and with it, a storm of emotions. On the other side of the court, Diana Bonner of the Mercury was boiling. She'd waited her entire career for this moment, and now she was performing in what felt like an empty theater. After the final buzzer, she didn't hold back. You work your entire career for moments like this, and you just hope people care enough to show up, she told reporters, voice sharp with frustration. Then she dropped the line that echoed across social media. "It's disrespectful, awful. We are worthy of crowded arenas."
That wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. Because for players like Wilson and Bonner, the finals weren't supposed to be just another game. They were supposed to be the moment the world finally saw them, the payoff for years of progress and promises. Instead, it felt like proof that the hype was never real to begin with. The images went viral, not for the basketball, but for what the arena looked like. A ghost town, a symbol of a league that had been celebrated in headlines, but abandoned in reality. And that's when the conversation started to shift. The fans weren't the problem. The marketing wasn't the problem. The issue ran deeper, into the very foundation of how the WNBA built its identity this season. Because this collapse wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck or poor scheduling. It was the visible symptom of a bubble that had quietly been inflating all year. And the finals were the moment it finally burst. But to understand why the arena was empty, we need to understand the emotional explosion that followed. Because behind the silence of that night came the sound of something breaking inside the league's biggest stars. Something shifted that night. Something you could feel, even through the screen. The disappointment wasn't just about ticket sales or attendance numbers. It was deeper, heavier. You could see it written across the faces of the players who had built this league with their sweat, their skill, and their faith that the world was finally paying attention. The silence inside that arena wasn't just awkward, it was cruel. And for the stars on the floor, it felt like a betrayal. A'ja Wilson felt it first. She's not just a player. She's the heartbeat of the WNBA, the face of this new era, the kind of athlete you build entire franchises and marketing campaigns around. Yet in that moment, standing under the blinding lights of the finals, she looked around and saw more empty seats than faces. Cameras caught her expression, disbelief fading into something close to heartbreak. She later admitted that during warm-ups, she caught herself whispering under her breath, "This is the finals?" It wasn't arrogance or ego. It was the shock of realizing that the moment she'd worked her whole life for, the one the league had hyped as a cultural turning point, had arrived to the sound of crickets. When Wilson finally spoke after the game, her tone wasn't angry. It was almost too calm. That quiet, measured voice said more than any outburst could have. She said, "We're playing some of the best basketball out there, but it's like nobody's watching." There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion. That line spread across social media in seconds because it cut straight to the truth. The WNBA's players were performing at the highest level of their lives, but their league couldn't even fill the stands to watch them do it. On the other side of the court, Diana Bonner's reaction couldn't have been more different. Where Wilson held her frustration like a secret, Bonner let hers explode. In her post-game interview, she didn't sugarcoat a thing. She said, "You work your entire career for moments like this, and you just hope people care enough to show up." Then came the line that turned the finals from a disappointment into a reckoning. "It's disrespectful, awful. We are worthy of crowded arenas." That one sentence hit harder than any stat or scoreboard could. The clip spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Reposted, clipped, dissected. Some fans applauded her honesty. Others accused her of being ungrateful. But no matter how you felt about her words, one thing was undeniable. She spoke the truth. It wasn't just a bad turnout. It was the breaking of a promise. The league had told these players that things were changing, that women's basketball had finally broken through, that this time people cared. But when the biggest night of the season came, the seats told a different story. That's what made their anger so powerful. It wasn't about fame or money or attention. It was about respect. For years, these athletes had been the face of progress, used in campaigns and slogans about equality and empowerment. They'd carried the torch, done the interviews, smiled through the skepticism. And yet, in their defining moment, they were left standing in a half-empty arena, realizing that maybe the story they'd been told, the one they'd believed in, wasn't real. Wilson's quiet heartbreak and Bonner's fiery outbursts were two sides of the same truth. The system had failed them. Their emotions were raw, unfiltered, and painfully human. This wasn't just a sports story anymore. It was a mirror reflecting the fragile foundation the league had been standing on. And as the footage of those interviews played over and over, fans and analysts began to ask the question no one wanted to confront. How could the WNBA's biggest stars feel this invisible in the middle of what was supposed to be its most successful season ever? Because underneath all the anger and sadness was one unspoken realization. This collapse wasn't random. It was a symptom. The emptiness of that arena wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It represented the gap between what the league had promised and what it had actually built. And as Wilson and Bonner walked off the court, it became clear that something fundamental had cracked inside the WNBA's illusion of unstoppable growth.
But to understand why that crack appeared, we need to look past the emotion and dig into the foundation, into the single force that had been propping up the entire illusion of success. Because the truth, as we're about to uncover, is that the WNBA's boom was never really about the league at all. It was about one player, one name, one phenomenon. And when she wasn't there, the entire structure fell apart. For months, the WNBA had been living inside a dream, a golden age powered by a single electrifying force, Caitlin Clark. She wasn't just a rookie, she was a movement. Every arena she entered became a sold-out show. Every broadcast she touched turned into a ratings surge. Her name alone could turn casual sports fans into ticket buyers, and brands lined up to attach themselves to her rise. She didn't just play basketball, she shifted the entire economy of the league. At first, it felt like a revolution. Suddenly, tickets were scarce, merch was flying off shelves, and networks were competing for airtime. The numbers looked unbelievable. Attendance records shattered, viewership doubled, engagement through the roof. The headlines called it the Caitlin Clark effect, and it was easy to believe this was the start of something permanent. It wasn't just one star. It was supposedly a rising tide lifting the entire WNBA. But tides don't rise forever. Because the finals proved something the league never wanted to admit. Caitlin Clark wasn't a tide. She was the ocean. When she wasn't there, when her team didn't make it to the championship, everything changed. The momentum vanished almost overnight. The casual fans who had flooded the arenas earlier in the season stopped showing up. The broadcasters who had built segments around her highlights suddenly had nothing to promote. The hype machine went silent. And the finals, the very event that was supposed to showcase the league's depth, collapsed under the weight of that absence. It was like someone had turned off the power. Without Clark, the demand evaporated. The same tickets that would have sold for hundreds if she'd been on the floor now struggled to move for $30. Analysts called it market fatigue, but that was a polite way of describing something much worse. A total dependency. Because once the numbers started to drop, it became obvious that the WNBA's historic season wasn't built on sustained interest or league-wide growth. It was built on a bubble inflated by one extraordinary player. You could see it in the metrics. The Indiana Fever's road games had broken attendance records everywhere they went, not because fans were suddenly invested in women's basketball, but because they wanted to see her. When she didn't play, the numbers plummeted. When she did, arenas filled up. It wasn't systemic progress. It was a single-person phenomenon that the league mistook for a movement. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Caitlin Clark's impact wasn't additive to the WNBA's success. It was foundational. She wasn't the cherry on top of a growing brand. She was the brand. Everything, the ticket sales, the sponsorships, the viewership spikes, all traced back to her. And the finals exposed just how fragile that foundation really was. Social media summed it up perfectly with one brutal phrase: no Clark, no crowd. It became the unofficial slogan of the finals, a rallying cry for critics who had been warning all season that the league's growth was an illusion. For months, WNBA leadership had pointed to the record numbers as proof of their strategy's success, that investing in visibility, partnerships, and storytelling was finally paying off. But the finals revealed that it wasn't strategy at all. It was proximity.
The closer you were to Caitlin Clark, the more valuable your product became. Remove her, and the value collapsed. That's why the finals hit so hard, because it wasn't just a bad night, it was a market correction, a painful public reminder that hype doesn't equal health. The empty seats weren't a random failure, they were evidence, proof that the league had mistaken the gravity of a single star for the strength of an entire galaxy. And when that star was no longer in orbit, everything else started to drift apart. For the players, that realization was devastating. They'd been told that the league's success was their success, that the attention, coverage, and the sudden spotlight would trickle down, raise salaries, boost exposure, and finally give women's basketball the respect it deserved. But when the finals rolled around and the crowds disappeared, the truth became impossible to ignore. Without Clark, the league wasn't growing. It was gasping. That's what made the frustration from players like A'ja Wilson and Diana Bonner so raw. Deep down, they knew the uncomfortable reality. The love, the coverage, the sudden spotlight, it wasn't evenly distributed. The WNBA had built an empire around one person, and when she was gone, the illusion shattered. And now, with the bubble burst, the league was left to face a terrifying question. How do you build something sustainable when your entire foundation depends on one star? Because if Caitlin Clark was the spark that lit the fire, the finals proved what happens when that fire goes out. The room doesn't just go dark, it gets cold. The night of the finals wasn't just an embarrassment, it was an economic revelation. When those ticket prices hit rock bottom, it wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system revealing itself. $35 for a championship seat wasn't a discount, it was a diagnosis. The kind that tells you something far deeper is wrong. For a league that had been celebrated for record growth, those empty seats told a story no press release could spin. The numbers were never as strong as they seemed.
The term market correction usually belongs to Wall Street, but it fits perfectly here. Because what happened in Las Vegas wasn't about basketball, it was about value, and how quickly that value evaporates when built on a single name. Caitlin Clark's absence didn't just lower interest, it shattered the illusion of demand. The WNBA didn't lose fans, it lost the reason casual fans were there in the first place. And when the finals arrived without her, the market adjusted, brutally, publicly, and in real time. The images told the story better than any analyst could. Wide shots of half-empty rows, floor seats going unsold, ticket resellers slashing prices mid-game just to break even. These weren't isolated incidents. They were proof that the so-called historic boom had a single point of failure. Remove Clark, and the entire equation collapsed. What had been hyped as a cultural breakthrough suddenly looked like a celebrity-driven event bubble. And that's a dangerous place for any league to live. Analysts began comparing it to the early days of boxing after Mike Tyson, or golf post-Tiger Woods. Industries built around magnetic personalities, not sustainable ecosystems. When the icons fade, so does the audience. But the difference here is that the WNBA never had time to diversify its appeal. It went all in on the Clark effect, and the finals proved just how catastrophic that gamble was. Because when the curtain lifted and the league had to stand on its own, it simply couldn't. Fans noticed, so did sponsors. The viral jokes online, $6 tickets, ghost town finals, no Clark, no crowd, weren't just memes, they were brand poison. Every image of those empty seats weakened the league's credibility, erasing months of good PR in a single weekend. And for players like A'ja Wilson, who had spent years building reputations on consistency and excellence, that was devastating. It wasn't just that the fans didn't show up, it was that the entire narrative they'd been told about progress and recognition fell apart overnight. The real sting came from the comparison. If Caitlin Clark had been in that game, those same seats would have sold for hundreds, maybe even thousands. Not because of the teams, not because of the championship stakes, but because of her. That's what made this correction so brutal. It exposed how fragile the league's growth actually was. This wasn't sustainable momentum, it was gravity distortion. The kind that only exists when one massive object pulls everything else into its orbit. And once she wasn't there to hold it all together, the league's center of gravity vanished. The finals didn't fail because people stopped caring. They failed because the league had misread what they cared about in the first place. The truth hit hard.
The WNBA's numbers weren't lying, but they were misleading. Yes, attendance was up. Yes, ratings had soared. But it wasn't league-wide health. It was concentrated energy drawn toward a single star. The finals stripped away that illusion and left behind the uncomfortable reality, a product that couldn't sell itself once the phenomenon was removed. This is what economists call the post-hero dip. It's what happens when success depends on a personality rather than a product. The dip comes fast, harsh, and public. And for the WNBA, it couldn't have come at a worse time. Right as the league was trying to convince sponsors, broadcasters, and investors that it was entering a new era of mainstream legitimacy. What the finals showed instead was fragility. It showed that beneath the glossy marketing, beneath the slogans about empowerment and equality, there was a league still fighting for its financial oxygen. That's not a criticism, it's a reality check. Because the moment Caitlin Clark wasn't on the court, the WNBA's balance sheet started to look like a house without a foundation. For the players, that's the cruelest part. They weren't just competing for a trophy, they were competing for validation. Every dunk, every shot, every win was meant to prove that the league didn't need a single savior. And yet the finals proved the opposite. The fans didn't come for the story, they came for the spectacle. And without the spectacle, the story was empty. That's why this wasn't just an attendance problem, it was a trust problem. The trust between the league and its players, between the narrative and the numbers, between what people believed and what the market revealed. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a stumble. It was a collapse that demanded accountability, starting from the top. Because when a market corrects, someone always pays the price. And in this case, the first to pay weren't the owners or executives. It was the players, the ones left standing in that echoing arena, wondering what, if anything, was real. When the finals fell apart, fans weren't just looking at the empty seats. They were looking for someone to blame. And the spotlight turned, almost instantly, toward the league's leadership.
At the center of it all was Commissioner Kathy Engelbert, a figure already under quiet scrutiny from players and analysts. But during Game 1 of the finals, she made a mistake that turned quiet criticism into open outrage. Cameras caught her walking out of the arena just minutes after the game began, right past rows of empty seats. No words, no statement, just a silent exit that became a viral symbol of everything wrong with the WNBA's leadership. Within hours, the clip was everywhere, captioned, memed, dissected. Whether it was frustration, embarrassment, or just bad timing didn't matter. To the public, it looked like the league's top official abandoning ship in the middle of its biggest disaster. Players noticed too. A'ja Wilson didn't say her name directly, but her post-game comments carried weight. Others didn't hold back. Nafisa Collier, a player union vice president, said it outright. "We have the finest players in the world, but the poorest leadership imaginable." That one sentence became the new headline, a quote that cut deeper than any attendance stat ever could. The finals had already exposed the league's dependence on one star. Now it exposed something even more damaging, a leadership team completely disconnected from the reality of its players and fans. Instead of addressing the issue head-on, Engelbert and her office stayed silent for days. No statement, no explanation. That silence echoed louder than the crowd that never came. It was more than a PR failure. It was a crisis of trust, because in that moment, the players realized something chilling. When the league fell apart, there was no one at the top ready to stand with them. And that single moment, the image of the commissioner walking away from a half-empty finals arena became the symbol of a league not just struggling to grow, but struggling to lead. In the days after the finals collapse, a new theory started to take over the conversation, one that made the league's problems look even worse. Fans began asking a dangerous question. What if the attendance has always been worse than it looks? It started on Reddit and spread like wildfire through sports Twitter. Posts claimed the WNBA had been artificially inflating attendance numbers for years, counting unsold corporate seats as paid tickets and giving away thousands of freebies just to make arenas look fuller on camera. According to this theory, the finals didn't just fail, they exposed the illusion that had been hiding in plain sight all season.
Normally, the league could mask empty seats by closing sections or cropping camera angles, but not this time. The crowd was so thin that even those tricks couldn't save the broadcast. The camera panned across rows of red chairs, and for the first time, the numbers stopped adding up. How could a league claiming record-breaking growth have a finals that looked like a preseason scrimmage? To be clear, these are rumors, not confirmed facts. But perception is everything, and the perception hit hard. The idea that the WNBA might have been propping up its success shattered what little trust was left. Fans who had once defended the league started questioning everything. The ticket sales, the sponsorship numbers, even the TV ratings. It was a nightmare for the league's image. What should have been a story about a championship turned into a detective case, with fans playing analysts, digging through screenshots, spreadsheets, and attendance records, trying to uncover what was real. Whether the theory was true or not almost didn't matter. The damage was done. The finals had become undeniable proof in the eyes of the public that something about the WNBA's success story didn't add up. And the worst part? The league's silence only fueled the fire. No denial, no clarification, just quiet. The same quiet that echoed through that half-empty arena. Because when people sense they've been misled, silence doesn't calm them, it confirms their suspicion. When the dust settled after the finals, the damage went far beyond bad optics. It wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. It was about power. Because while players were arguing online, behind the scenes, the league and its players were preparing for something far more serious, the next collective bargaining war. For months, players had been pushing for change, higher salaries, better revenue sharing, improved travel conditions, and a bigger voice in league decisions. They'd built their argument around growth. The WNBA is booming. The money's coming in. It's time players get their fair share. But after the finals, that entire argument collapsed overnight. Owners and executives didn't need to say much. They just had to hold up a single image, rows of empty seats during what was supposed to be the league's biggest event. The visual said everything. You want more money? Look at this. It was a devastating shift in leverage. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. What had been a story about momentum and empowerment turned into one about sustainability and survival. The league's leadership could now argue that the growth everyone was celebrating wasn't real, that it was temporary, inflated, dependent on one superstar and one viral moment. And for players like A'ja Wilson, Diana Bonner, and others who had poured their hearts into pushing the game forward, it felt like betrayal all over again. The very system that failed to market them properly was now using that failure as a weapon against them. Social media clips of empty seats were quietly repurposed in negotiations, a subtle reminder from ownership that the WNBA's financial reality didn't match the hype. The message was clear: you don't have the leverage you think you do. The irony was brutal. The players' frustration had been righteous. They deserved better marketing, better leadership, better support. But by speaking out emotionally, they had also handed ownership proof that the system wasn't strong enough to justify bigger payouts. Their honesty became ammunition.
Behind closed doors, agents and union reps reportedly warned players to stay quiet, that every emotional quote, every viral moment could be twisted into a bargaining chip against them. Meanwhile, owners positioned themselves as the realists, saying they loved the game but couldn't fund unprofitable fantasy. That's what made the fallout so darkly poetic. The finals were supposed to symbolize equality and progress, a league finally standing on solid ground. Instead, they turned into the image owners would use to justify staying exactly where they are. The WNBA entered the offseason not as a unified front, but as a fractured battlefield. Players versus executives, optimism versus reality, hype versus economics. And somewhere in the middle stood the uncomfortable truth. The players weren't wrong to demand more. They were just trapped in a system that couldn't sustain what it promised. The negotiation table isn't just about contracts anymore. It's about credibility. Because before the league can ask sponsors or fans to believe in its future, it has to prove that the foundation isn't made of smoke and mirrors. And right now,
That proof doesn't exist. By the time the finals ended, it was clear this wasn't just a bad look for the league, it was a system failure. Every part of the WNBA structure, from leadership to marketing to player relations, had been exposed. The bubble didn't just burst, it revealed what was underneath, and it wasn't pretty. For years, the league had sold an image of unity. Players, owners, and executives working together to grow the game, to prove the critics wrong, to build something bigger than themselves. But when the pressure came, that illusion fell apart. The final showed that the league's foundation wasn't built on solidarity or long-term strategy. It was built on wishful thinking and one superstar holding everything together. The emotional explosion from A'ja Wilson and Diana Bonner wasn't just anger in the moment. It was the breaking point of a deeper problem, a fracture that had been quietly spreading through the league for years. On the surface, everyone said the right things. We're growing, we're breaking records, the fans are here. But beneath that, there was resentment. The veterans felt overlooked. The new stars felt used, and everyone felt the pressure to pretend that everything was fine. The truth is, the WNBA had been living off momentum, not money, not infrastructure, not a loyal audience, but momentum. And momentum is fragile. It doesn't last when the story stops being exciting. Caitlin Clark was the story, and when her season ended, so did the league's heartbeat. What came next was chaos disguised as calm. Executives blamed the economy, players blamed the league office, fans blamed the media. But at the center of it all was one undeniable fact. The WNBA had no system strong enough to survive without its main attraction. It's not that the players aren't good enough, they're world-class. It's not that the product isn't entertaining, it absolutely is. The problem is that the league never learned how to sell the game without selling a name. It leaned too hard on one storyline and forgot to build a foundation that could stand when that story went quiet. That's why the finals hurt so much. It wasn't just empty seats. It was the feeling of a league staring into the mirror and realizing it didn't know who it was without Caitlin Clark. The growth wasn't shared. It was concentrated. The success wasn't structural, it was situational. And for players like A'ja Wilson, that realization was devastating. She wasn't just frustrated, she was disillusioned. Because her anger wasn't just about low attendance, it was about being made to believe that the progress was real, only to find out that it wasn't. She and every player who gave everything to this league had been carrying a dream that the system itself couldn't support. That's why her silence after that interview said more than words. You could see it in her body language, not just disappointment, but recognition. Recognition that the league she loved, the one she helped elevate, wasn't built for her to win off the court.
The broken system isn't just about marketing or money. It's about identity. The WNBA can't decide whether it wants to be a movement, a business, or a spectacle. And until it does, it'll keep living and dying by the presence of one or two stars. The finals didn't create that problem. They just made it impossible to ignore. And as players, owners, and fans argue over who's to blame, one truth is quietly setting in. The system isn't just cracked, it's collapsing under the weight of its own illusion. When the final buzzer sounded, it wasn't just the end of a game. It was the end of an illusion. The WNBA's 2025 season began as a dream. Record crowds, viral clips, new fans, and endless headlines about progress. But by the time the finals rolled around, the dream had cracked open to reveal something colder. A system stretched too thin, built too high, and resting on one player's shoulders. The bubble didn't leak slowly, it burst all at once. And in that sound, that eerie silence of an arena half empty on championship night, the truth became impossible to ignore.
This wasn't just about Caitlin Clark. It wasn't just about A'ja Wilson or Diana Bonner or a handful of frustrated stars. It was about what happens when an entire institution builds its identity around a moment instead of a model. When leadership mistakes hype for health. When progress becomes performance. And that's why the finals mattered. Not because of who won or lost, but because of what they exposed. A league still trying to define what success actually means. Was A'ja Wilson's frustration a cry for respect? Absolutely. Was it justified? Maybe more than anyone wants to admit. But it was also something else. A warning. Because if the WNBA doesn't learn from this moment, if it doesn't find a way to build something real and sustainable beyond one superstar's glow, this same silence will echo again. The fans who tuned in this season didn't just want highlights. They wanted history. They wanted to believe they were watching the rise of something permanent. But permanence requires truth, and this year, the truth came crashing down. Now the league stands at a crossroads. It can rebuild, admit its flaws, and learn to share the spotlight, or it can keep pretending everything's fine while the foundation keeps crumbling. So here's the real question. What do you think this was? Was the finals collapse just a fluke, the price of a young league learning to grow? Or was it the moment the illusion finally broke, exposing the reality beneath the brand? Drop your thoughts below, because this story isn't over. In fact, it's just getting started. If you believe, like we do, that the real story is never the official one, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and stay locked in, because we're already digging into our next investigation, one that could change how you see the entire WNBA narrative. And remember, the truth doesn't always make headlines. Sometimes it hides behind empty seats.